On this day in history, March 1st, 1476, forces of the Catholic monarchs engaged the combined Portuguese-Castilian armies of Afonso V and Prince John at the Battle of Toro. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Toro, a town of Spain in the province of Zamora, on the right bank of the river Douro, and on the Zamora-Medellin del Campo Railway. Population from 1930, 7,700. Toro is an ancient fortified town with picturesque narrow streets. A fine bridge spans the river. The Catholic Church is Romanesque. It dates from the 12th century, but has been partially restored. The palace of the Marqueses of Santa Cruz was the meeting place of the Cortes of 1371, 1442, and 1505, which made Toro and its code of laws celebrated. On this day in history, March 2nd, 986, Louis V becomes the last Carolingian king of West Francia after the death of his father, Lothair. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Louis V. Louis V, born 967, died 987, La Fainéant, King of France, succeeded his father Lothair in March 986, and finally embroiled the Carolingian dynasty with Hugh Capet and Adalberon, Archbishop of Reims. Louis died in May 987, his mother Emma being accused of having poisoned him. On this day in history, March 3rd, 1799, the Russo-Ottoman siege of Corfu ends with the surrender of the French garrison. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Corfu. In local tradition, Corcyra was the Homeric island of Scheria, the home of the Phoenicians. In early Greek times, it was colonized from Corinth, but seems to have had earlier settlers from Eritrea. The position of Corcyra, on the highway between Greece and the West, favored rapid growth and freedom of action, and its people, contrary to the practice of Corinthian colonies, maintained an independent and even hostile attitude towards the mother city. In the early part of the 7th century, their fleets fought the first naval battle recorded in Greek history, about 664 BC. The Corinthian tyrant Periander, circa 600, governed Corcyra by deputy, and induced it to join in the colonization of Apollonia and Anacatorium. But the island regained its independence and devoted itself to purely mercantile policy. During the Persian invasion of 480, it manned 60 ships, but took no active part. In 435, in a quarrel with Corinth, it sought assistance from Athens. This was one of the chief immediate causes of the Peloponnesian War, in which Corcyra was of considerable use to the Athenians as a naval station and a base for supplies, though it was twice nearly lost to Athens by internal feuds. On each occasion, 427 and 425, the popular party ultimately won. After a third abortive rising in 410, it passed out of the war. In 375, a fresh Athenian alliance resulted in hostilities with Sparta. In the Hellenistic period, Corcyra was besieged by Cassander, and occupied in turn by Agathocles Pyrrhus and Illyrian corsairs. From these last, in 229, it was delivered by the Romans, who retained it as a naval base and made it a free state. In 31 BC, Octavian used it as a base against Antony, but his victory foundation, Nicopolis, soon outrivaled it, and Corcyra for long passed out of notice. With the rise of the Norman kingdom in Sicily and the Italian naval powers, Corcyra became a frequent object of attack. In 1081 to 1085, it was held by Robert Guiscard. In 1147 to 1154 by Roger II of Sicily. In 1197 to 1207 by Genovese privateers who were expelled by the Venetians. In 1214 to 1259, it passed to the Greek despots of Epirus, and in 1267 to the Neapolitan House of Anjou. Under this weak rule, the island suffered from various adventurers. In 1386, it placed itself under the protection of Venice, and in 1401 under its formal sovereignty. Corcyra remained in Venetian hands till 1797, though several times attacked by the Turks, with notable sieges in 1536 and 1716 to 1718. Under Venetian feudalism, the island took the new name of Corfu. The Corfiotes were encouraged to cultivate the olive, but were debarred from commercial competition with Venice. The island served as a refuge for Greek scholars from Turkish conquests, and in 1732 became the home of the first academy of modern Greece. But no serious impulse to Greek thought came from this quarter. By the Treaty of Campo Formio, Corfu was ceded to the French, until they were expelled by a Russo-Turkish armament, 1799. For a short time it became the capital of the self-governing Federation of the Heftanissos, 7 islands. In 1807, its faction-ridden government was again replaced by a French administration, and in 1809 it was attacked by a British fleet. By the Treaty of Paris of November 5, 1815, the Ionian Islands were placed under the protectorate of Great Britain, and Corfu became the seat of the British High Commissioner. Though the native Senate and Assembly were retained, British administration improved conditions, but its strictness displeased the natives, and in 1864 Corfu was ceded with the other Ionian Islands to the Kingdom of Greece, in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants. Although the neutralization of Corfu was maintained after the Balkan Wars, its military importance grew so greatly during World War I, after the Serbian retreat across Albania, that the French, ignoring a Greek protest, landed there on January 11, 1916. They were followed by the first detachment of retreating Serbs 4 days later, and by February 10th, some 75,000 Serbian troops, as well as Montenegrin soldiers, had been landed in the island, whither on the previous day the Serbian government had transported its seat, and where, on September 10th, the Serbian parliament met in the theater. In July 1917, the Pact of Corfu was signed, which proclaimed the union of the Yugoslavs. On October 27, 1923, the Italian delegate for the delimitation of the Albanian frontier, General Tellini, was assassinated at Cracovia. There was no proof that the assassins were Greek, but Signor Mussolini held the Hellenic government responsible and sent an Italian fleet to Corfu, which bombarded the town and killed several Greek and Armenian refugees. After extracting from Greece 50 million lira as an indemnity, the Italians evacuated Corfu. In World War II, the island was bombed heavily by the Italians. It fell to the Germans during the Balkan Campaign of April 1941. On this day in history, March 4th, 1791, Vermont is admitted to the United States as the 14th state. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the state. The first white man to visit the region now known as Vermont, so far as the records show, was Samuel Champlain, father of New France. Joining an Algonquin war party on the foray into the Iroquois country, July 4th, 1609, he entered the lake which he named Lake Champlain. For well nigh a century and a half, the Champlain Valley was French territory. The increase of the Iroquois compelled the French in Canada to erect a chain of forts to command the approach by way of Lake Champlain and its outlet, the Richelieu River, the great trunk-line highway from the valley of St. Lawrence River to southern New England and the Hudson Valley. As the English settlements in Massachusetts and adjacent colonies grew stronger, the Indians gradually withdrew into Canada, and, sullen and revengeful, were ready to join the French in raids upon the English settlements. The first permanent English settlement was a blockhouse erected in 1724 in the town of Brattleboro, and known as Fort Dummer. Later in the same year, a group of Dutch squatters settled in the town of Pownal, in the southwestern corner of Vermont. But not until the British captured Canada in 1760 did the tide of emigration flow into the state. Benning Wentworth, royal governor of New Hampshire, assuming that the rather vague limits of his province, like those of Connecticut and Massachusetts, extended westward to a line 20 miles east of the Hudson River, proceeded to make grants of land between the Connecticut River and Lake Champlain. From 1749 to 1764, he granted 131 townships, and the region was commonly known as the New Hampshire Grants. Lieutenant Governor Golden of New York challenged the right of the New Hampshire executive to grant these lands. For 14 years, the ownership of the disputed region was debated, and on July 20th, 1764, an order of the king and council gave a decision in favor of New York. Thereupon, the New York governors proceeded to grant lands in what is now known as the state of Vermont. Following the close of the French and Indian War and prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution, several thousand persons, largely from Connecticut and Massachusetts, had purchased lands in the New Hampshire grants, had cleared farms, built houses, and planted crops. In 1770, a test case was brought in the New York courts in an ejectment suit concerning property in the town of Shaftesbury, and the court refused to consider the New Hampshire charter as evidence. Ethan Allen, in charge of the defense, returned to Bennington, where the town voted to protect its rights by force if necessary. A military organization was formed, which came to be known as the Green Mountain Boys, Ethan Allen being its commander. In eastern Vermont, New York authority was recognized, and no attempt was made to dispossess settlers. But in western Vermont, New York authority was successfully defied. New Hampshire titles were defended. With the Revolution, the Green Mountain Boys, commanded by Ethan Allen, with some aid from Connecticut and Massachusetts on May 10, 1775, captured the fortress of Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. The capture was the first aggressive act on the part of the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Vermonters participated in the invasion of Canada in the autumn of 1775, and Ethan Allen was captured by the British in an unsuccessful attempt to take Montreal. A rudimentary form of government was maintained through the Committees of Safety. Conventions were held in 1776 looking toward statehood, Ira Allen being active in behalf of a separate government. On January 16, 1777, a Declaration of Independence was adopted and the name New Connecticut was given the new state. The name was soon abandoned, as it had been used elsewhere, and the name Vermont was substituted. In July 1777, a state constitution was drafted in a convention held at Windsor. This was the first convention adopted by an American state to forbid slavery and to establish manhood suffrage. The new state government was set up in March 1778 with Thomas Chittenden as governor. The British, under General Burgoyne, captured the Lake Champlain forts in July 1777, and the rear guard of the American army, retreating from Ticonderoga, was defeated at Hubbardton, Vermont, July 7, 1777. In an attempt to capture American stores at Bennington, British detachments under Colonel Baum and Breyman were defeated by an American force consisting of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts troops, commanded by General John Stark, on August 16, 1777. This was the beginning of Burgoyne's reverses, which ended in his surrender to General Gates. The new state of Vermont continued to function, although opposed by foes at home and abroad. In 1790, New York, under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton, recognized the independence of Vermont conditioned upon the payment of $30,000, and on March 4, 1791, the Green Mountain Commonwealth was the first state admitted to the Union after the original 13. Settlement was rapid during the latter years of the Revolutionary War. A rough consensus showed about 7,000 people in the state in 1771. In 1791, the number rose to 85,525. After her declaration of independence, the state granted her own lands. In 1779, the legislature planned that they were to be in townships 6 miles square, with 70 rights or divisions in each. 5 divisions in each were reserved: 1 for the support of a college, 1 for a county grammar school, 1 for an English school, 1 for the support of preaching, and 1 for the first settled minister. The legislature convened in several of the larger towns of the state until 1808, when the capital was permanently situated at Montpelier. Many little iron mines were opened, and small forges put in operation with charcoal as fuel. This was an industry which is no longer found. The iron and other businesses were stimulated by the War of 1812. In this war, Vermont troops took part in the battles of Chippewa, Lundy's Lane, Lake Erie, and Plattsburgh. But the only engagement in the state itself was the defense of Fort Casson at the mouth of the Otter Creek in 1813. Steady expansion followed. Farm produce and cattle were sold south to older markets. The lumber business began to be developed in the Connecticut Valley and along the shores of Lake Champlain, where water transportation was available. The demand at first being principally for ship timber. During the winter, The lines of sledges took the produce of the Champlain region to Montreal, just as that from the southwestern part was taken to Albany, and that from the Connecticut Valley to Portsmouth of Boston. The opening of the Champlain Canal in 1823, connecting Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, largely increased commerce with New York and diverted trade from Canada. Stage lines began to carry the mail and passengers throughout the state. Many towns to which they went had a larger population in 1820 than in 1920. The decade between 1820 and 1830 was the last one in which there was a marked increase of population in the state. After that, many Vermonters were seized with a desire to go west, and so they helped to build many of the northern states of the Mississippi Valley. Many also went south, to the rising industrial centers of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Despite these great losses, the population continued to increase, aided in later years by an influx population of French Canadians from Canada. During the Civil War, a small band of Confederates crossed the frontier from Canada and raided the town of St. Albans. In 1870, St. Albans was the headquarters of an attempted Fenian invasion of Canada. Sheep raising was an important farm industry before and after the Civil War, but after 1880 declined rapidly because of competition from the western states and Australia. The Vermont Central, between Windsor and Burlington, and the Rutland from Bellows Falls to Burlington were completed in 1849. In presidential campaigns, the state was Federalist from 1792 to 1800, Democratic Republican 1804 to 20, Adams Republican 1824 to 28, Anti-Masonic 1832, Whig 1836 to 52, and Republican since 1856. On this day in history, March 5th, 1748, Jonas Carlson Dryander, Swedish botanist and biologist, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the botanist. Jonas Dryander, born 1748, died 1810. Swedish botanist, was educated at Gothenburg, Lund, and at Uppsala under Linnaeus. He visited England in 1782 and became librarian to Sir Joseph Banks. He was librarian to the Royal Society and also to the Linnean Society, of which he was one of the founders in 1788. He was vice president of the society till his death in London on October 19, 1810. Besides various papers, Dryander published Dissertatio Graduis Fungos Regno Vegetabili Vidicans, Lund, 1776, and Catalogus Bibliotheca Historico-Naturalis, Josephi Banks, Bart, London, 1796 to 1800, 5 volumes, and edited Ayton's Hortus Coensis and Roxburgh's Plants of the Coast of Coromandel. On this day in history, March 6th, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan arrives at Guam. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the island. Guam was discovered by Magellan in 1521. He was so much annoyed by the thefts which were committed by the natives that he gave the whole group of islands to which Guam belongs the name Islas de la Ladrones, Thieves' Islands. The name has still persisted to some extent, although the official name of the group was later established as Mariana, in honor of the widow of King Philip IV of Spain. There was no attempt to conquer Guam until the latter part of the 17th century, when the Spaniards subdued the island after considerable bloodshed. It remained a Spanish possession until 1898, when the U.S. warship, Charlestown, steamed into the harbor of Apra and commenced to shell the old fort. The Spanish governor, cut off from the communication with the outside world, took this as a friendly salute and surrendered the island without opposition when the situation was explained to him. Guam was ceded to the United States, and the other islands of the Marianas were sold by Spain to Germany in 1899. After World War I, Japan, which had occupied the German island possessions north of the equator, received these South Sea islands, the Marianas, Caroline, and Marshall groups, as a mandate under the League of Nations. Japan retained possession of the islands after it quit the League in 1935. Guam was entirely demilitarized after the Washington Treaty of Naval Limitation of 1922. The position of Guam in a U.S.-Japanese war was certain to be precarious, because the island is surrounded by the Micronesian islands which Japan controls. The nearest of these islands, Rota, is only about 30 miles to the north of Guam. The question of fortifying Guam came up sporadically for consideration after Japan had denounced the Washington Treaty and thereby opened the way to fortification of the island possessions of other powers. Congress was never willing to appropriate funds for the purpose, partly because of the belief that such a move might precipitate war with Japan, partly because of doubt in the minds of some naval experts as to whether Guam, in its exposed position, could be made secure against air bombardment. Some funds for harbor improvement and provision of air facilities were voted in 1941, and a number of skilled workers were brought over from the United States in that year. But the force at Guam, some 400 Marines and about 155 sailors, was quite inadequate to protect an island which, with its fairly extensive coastline, offered a number of opportunities for landing to an attacking force. The Japanese effected landings in Guam in the first days of the war with the U.S., and the occupation of the island was apparently completed on December 12, 1941. On this day in history, March 7, 1138, Konrad III von Hohenstaufen was elected King of Germany at Koblenz in the presence of the papal legate Theodwin. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Konrad. Konrad III, born 1093, died 1152, German king, second son of Frederick I, Duke of Swabia, and Agnes, daughter of the Emperor Henry IV, was the first king of the Hohenstaufen family. His father died in 1105, and his mother married secondly Leopold III, Margrave of Austria. In 1115, his uncle, the Emperor Henry V, appointed him Duke of Franconia. In 1116, together with his elder brother Frederick II, Duke of Swabia, he was left by Henry as regent of Germany, and when the emperor died in 1125, he became titular king of Burgundy, or Arles. In 1126, he took part in the war between his brother Frederick and the new king, Lothair the Saxon, and was chosen king in opposition to Lothair on December 18, 1127. Hastening across the Alps, he was crowned King of Italy at Monza in June 1128, and in spite of the papal ban was generally acknowledged in northern Italy. The rival popes, Innocent II and Anacletus II, both declared against him. The Romans repudiated him, and after failing to seize the extensive possessions left by Matilda, Marchioness of Tuscany, he returned to Germany in 1132. He continued the struggle against Lothair till October 1135, when he submitted, was pardoned, and recovered his estates. In 1136 he accompanied the imperial forces to Italy in the capacity of standard-bearer, and sought to win the favor of Pope Innocent II. In December 1137 Lothair died, and some of the princes met at Koblenz, and chose Konrad for a second time as German king on March 7, 1138. In the presence of the papal legate. Crowned at Aix-la-Chapelle 6 days later, he was acknowledged at Bamberg by several of the South German princes, but his position could not be strong while Henry the Proud, the powerful Duke of Bavaria and Saxony, refused his allegiance. Attempts at a peaceful settlement of this rivalry failed, and Henry was placed under the ban in July 1138, when war broke out in Bavaria and Saxony. The king was unable to make much headway, in spite of the death of the Duke Henry, which occurred in October 1139, and his half-brother Leopold IV, Margrave of Austria, to whom Bavaria had been entrusted, was defeated by Henry's brother Welf, afterwards Duke of Spoleto and Margrave of Tuscany. Konrad captured the fortress of Weissenberg from Welf in December 1140, and is said to have allowed the women to leave the town, each with as much of her property as she could carry on her back. To his surprise, so the story runs, each woman came out bearing on her back a husband, a father, or a brother, who thus escaped the conquerors. Peace was made at Frankfurt in May 1142, when Henry the Lion, son of Henry the Proud, was confirmed in the Duchy of Saxony, while Bavaria was given to Konrad's stepbrother, Henry Josemgert, Margrave of Austria, who married Gertrude, the widow of Henry the Proud. Affairs in Italy demanded the attention of the king, as Roger I, King of Sicily, had won considerable authority on the mainland and refused to recognize the German king, whose help Pope Lucius II implored against the rebellious Romans. This state of affairs drove Konrad into alliance with the East Roman Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who, in 1146, married his stepsister. But the condition of Germany prevented the contemplated campaign against Roger. The solitary success amid the general disorder in the empire was the expedition undertaken in 1142 by Konrad into Bohemia, where he restored his brother-in-law, Ladislao, to this throne. At an attempt, however, to perform the same service for another brother-in-law, also called Ladislao, who had been driven from his Polish dukedom, ended in failure. Disorder was rampant in Saxony, Bavaria, and Burgundy, and in 1146 war broke out between the Bavarians and the Hungarians. A term was placed to this condition of affairs by the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, and the consequent departure of many turbulent nobles on crusade. In December 1146, the king himself took the cross, secured the election and coronation of his young son Henry as his successor, appointed Henry I, Archbishop of Mainz, as his guardian, and set out for Palestine in the autumn of 1147. Marching with a large and splendid army through Hungary, he reached Asia Minor, where his forces were decimated by disease and by the sword. Stricken by illness, Conrad returned to Constantinople at Christmas 1147, but in March 1148 set out to rejoin his troops. Having shared in the fruitless attack on Damascus, he left Palestine in September 1148 and passed the ensuing winter at Constantinople, where he made fresh plans for an attack on Roger of Sicily. He reached Italy by sea, but the news that Roger had allied himself with Louis VII, King of France, and his old opponent, Welf of Bavaria, compelled him to return hastily to Germany. He was obliged to neglect repeated invitations from the Romans, who sent him a specially urgent letter in 1149, and consequently never received the imperial crown. Conrad died on February 15, 1152, at Bamberg, where he was buried. By his wife Gertrude, daughter of Berengar, Count of Sulzbach, he had 2 sons, the elder of whom, Henry, died in 1150. Passing over his younger son Frederick on account of his youth, he appointed as his successor his nephew, Frederick III, Duke of Swabia, afterwards the Emperor Frederick I. On this day in history, March 8, 1126, following the death of his mother, Queen Urraca of Leon, Alfonso VII is proclaimed King of Leon. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Alfonso. Alfonso VII, the Emperor, from 1126 to 1157, is a dignified and somewhat enigmatical figure. A vague tradition had always assigned the title of emperor to the sovereign who held Leon as the most direct representative of the Visigoth kings, who were themselves the representatives of the Roman Empire. But though given in charters and claimed by Alfonso VI and the Battler, the title had been little more than a flourish of rhetoric. Alfonso VII was crowned emperor in 1135, after the death of the Battler. The weakness of Aragon enabled him to make his superiority effective. He appears to have striven for the formation of a national unity, which Spain had never possessed since the fall of the Visigoth kingdom. The elements he had to deal with could not be welded together. Alfonso was at once a patron of the Church and a protector, if not a favorer, of the Mohammedans, who formed a large part of his subjects. His reign ended in an unsuccessful campaign against the rising power of the Almohades. Though he was not actually defeated, his death in the pass of Moradel in the Sierra Morena, while on his way back to Toledo, occurred in circumstances which showed that no man could be what he claimed to be, king of the men of the 2 religions. His personal character does not stand out with the emphasis of those of Alfonso VI or the Battler. Yet he was a great king, the type and, to some extent, the victim of the confusions of his age, Christian in creed and ambition, but more than half Oriental in his household. On this day in history, March 9, 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte marries his first wife, Joséphine de Beauharnais. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the Empress. Joséphine. Marie-Rose Joséphine Taché de la Pagière, born 1763, died 1814, Empress of the French, was born in the island of Martinique on June 23, 1763, being the eldest of 3 daughters of Joseph Taché de la Pagière, lieutenant of artillery. She married in 1779 the Vicomte Alexandre Beauharnais. There were 2 children of the marriage, Eugene and Hortense. After a visit to her native island, Joséphine returned to Paris and made some sensation in society. As the revolution ran its course, her husband, as an ex-noble, incurred the suspicion and hostility of the Jacobins, and his ill success at the head of a French army on the Rhine led to his arrest and execution. Joséphine was left in a position of much perplexity and some hardship, but Barras and Madame Tallien assisted her, and she was one of the queens of Parisian society in the year 1795, when Napoleon Bonaparte's fame was beginning. His nomination to the command of the Army of Italy appears to have decided her to marry him. The civil marriage took place March 9, 1796, 2 days before the bridegroom set out for his command. Joséphine declined to accompany him to Nice and Italy. Bonaparte's letters to Joséphine during the campaign revealed the ardor of his love, while she rarely answered him. During his absence in Egypt in 1798 to 1799, her relations to an officer, Monsieur Charles, were most compromising, and Bonaparte on his return thought of divorcing her. Her tears and entreaties of Eugene and Hortense availed to bring about a reconciliation, and during the period of the consulate, 1799 to 1804, their relations were on the whole happy, though Napoleon's conduct now gave his consort grave cause for concern. His brothers and sisters more than once begged him to divorce Joséphine, and from the time when he became first consul for life, August 1802, with large powers over the choice of a successor, he kept open the alternative of a divorce. Josephine's anxieties increased on the proclamation of the Empire, May 18, 1804, and on the 1st of December, 1804, the eve of the coronation at Notre Dame, she gained her wish that she would be married anew to Napoleon with religious rites. Despite Josephine's care, Napoleon procured omission of one formality, the presence of the parish priest. But at the coronation scene, Joséphine appeared radiant with triumph over her envious relatives. The august marriages contracted by her children Eugene and Hortense seemed to establish her position. But her ceaseless extravagance and, above all, the impossibility that she should bear a son strained the relations between Napoleon and Joséphine. She complained of his infidelities and growing callousness. The end came in sight after the campaign of 1809, when Napoleon caused the announcement to be made to her that reasons of state compelled him to divorce her. Despite all her pleadings, he held his resolve. The most was made on the slight technical irregularity at the marriage ceremony of December 1, 1804, and the marriage was declared null and void. At her private retreat, La Malmaison, near Paris, which she had beautified with curios and rare plants and flowers, Joséphine closed her life in distinguished retirement. Napoleon more than once came to consult her upon matters in which he valued her tact and good sense. She died on May 29th, 1814. On this day in history, March 10th, 1535, Spaniard Fray Tomás de Berlanga, the fourth Bishop of Panama, discovers the Galapagos Islands by chance on his way to Peru. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the islands. Galapagos Islands, an archipelago in the Pacific consisting of 12 large and several hundred small islands on the equator, 650 miles due west of Ecuador, to which country they belong. Population from 1941, 2,156. They were discovered by the Spaniards early in the 16th century, but only 3 islands have ever been utilized, these chiefly as convict stations. At various times, they have been visited by British ships of war, New England whalers, pirates, buccaneers, and numerous scientific expeditions. Charles Darwin, when on the voyage of the Beagle, obtained from the insular forms of Galapagos finches valuable data for his Origin of Species. The English name of the major islands are Albemarle, Indefatigable, James, Narborough, Charles, Chatham, Hood, Barrington, Duncan, Tower, Bindelow, and Abington. Albemarle is irregular in shape, but most of the others are roughly circular, with a single high crater in the center. Albemarle is the largest, 75 miles in length, and in 1925 broke into eruption. Since then, the craters of Narborough have been active. The shores of the islands are low, while in the interior, craters may rise to an extreme height of 5,000 feet. The coast shows an alternation of dense mangroves, beaches of white sand, and rugged cliffs of gray lava. Very little rain falls near the sea, where the vegetation is semi-desert, chiefly cactus and thorn trees. The luxuriance increases on the uplands where the moisture becomes more general. The Antarctic Humboldt Current keeps the temperature of the surrounding water well below equatorial average. The name is derived from the Spanish Galápago, a tortoise, and refers to the giant forms which have evolved on the islands. Some of these have reached a length of 4 feet or more, weighing nearly 400 pounds, and individuals perhaps attain an age of 300 to 400 years, making them the oldest living animals on the earth. In past years, almost every island had its peculiar species of tortoise, but they are now on the verge of extinction. This has been due to the carrying away of thousands by whalers for food, to slaughter of great numbers for their oil, and the wholesale devouring of eggs and young by wild dogs and pigs. A remarkable fact about the Galapagos fauna is the large proportion of forms peculiar to the islands, namely 37% of all species of shorefish, 40% of the plants, and 96% of the reptiles. But the amount of zoological work remaining to be done is indicated by a collection of moths brought back by one of the most recent expeditions, of which half of the 52 species were new to science. The virtual absence of mankind since the times of the buccaneers has resulted in a remarkable absence of fear on the part of all forms of native animal life. In fact, the only really wild creatures are the dogs, cats, pigs, goats, and donkeys, which have been wrecked or intentionally left on the islands in past years. The sea lions, which are abundant and astonishingly tame, are of southern derivation, doubtless via the Humboldt Current. Besides small lizards and snakes, there are 2 large iguana-like lizards, one marine and feeding on algae, and both showing many primitive characters. 15 species of giant tortoises formerly inhabited the island, and 85 kinds of birds have been recorded. Of special interest are the flamingos, which breed on James Island, and the flightless cormorants, with diminutive wings, which are found only near Albemarle. But it is doubtful if there are more than 100 of these adult cormorants left in existence today. The small black finches exhibit amazing variation. Some have bills heavier and thicker than a grosbeak's, while in others the mandibles are as slender as those of a warbler. The dominant theory of the formation of these islands, first sponsored by Darwin, is that they have always been isolated both from one another and from the mainland, the gradual stocking being by accidental arrivals. Important evidence is accumulating, however, that at one time the submerged plateau which connects the archipelago with Central America was dry land. For instance, except for the penguins, which even today could easily swim from Peru along the Antarctic Humboldt Current, every species of native bird shows closer relations with Central than with South America. And much the same is true of other groups such as the shorefish and land plants, while the nearest relations of the giant tortoises are found fossils in Cuba. If the stocking of the Galapagos with living creatures had been by advantageous arrivals, they could only have come by the southern current, which turns westward at the latitude of Peru. There seems little doubt that the archipelago was at one time a single island. Furthermore, the presence of 5 forms of tortoises on Albemarle hints that formerly this island was more deeply submerged, so that only its 5 major craters were above water. The most recent scientific expeditions are those sent out by the New York Zoological Society, 2 under the direction of William Beebe, and the last under C.H. Townsend. The latter was successful in bringing back over 200 tortoises from Albemarle for distribution to various favorable situations, where efforts will be made to breed them and save the race from extinction. On this day in history, March 11th, 1544, Torquato Tasso, Italian poet and educator, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the poet. Torquato Tasso, born 1544, died 1595, Italian poet, son of Bernardo Tasso, was born at Sorrento on March 11, 1544. He was brought up at Naples, where he lived with his mother and his only sister Cornelia, and was educated by the Jesuits. He was a precocious child and famous in Naples for his learning when, at 10 years old, he joined his father in exile in Rome. In 1557, he accompanied his father to the court of Urbino. Torquato, a handsome and brilliant lad, now became the companion in sports and studies of the young heir, Duke Francesco Maria della Rovere. He met there many of the most famous scholars of the day, including Albus Manutius and the critic Speroni. At Venice, whither his father went to superintend the printing of the Amadigi, 1560, he found himself the pet and prodigy of a distinguished literary circle. He was then sent to study law at Padua, but his distaste for the subject led Bernardo to allow his son to exchange the study of law for that of philosophy and poetry at Padua, and then at Bologna. In 1561, he published some poems, and before the end of 1562 produced a narrative poem, Rinaldo, in 12 cantos, which proposed to combine the regularity of the Virgilian with the attractions of the Romantic epic. Tasso, who was still only 18 years old, sought to give the adventures of Roland a classic form. He was now famous. In 1565 he became attached to the learned court of Ferrara, at first in the service of the Cardinal Luigi de Este. The years between 1565 and 1570 seem to have been the happiest of Tasso's life, although his father's death in 1569 caused him profound pain. He was the idol of the most brilliant court in Italy. The princesses Lucrezia and Leonora de Este took him under their protection. He was admitted to their familiarity, and there is some reason to think that neither of them was indifferent to him personally. In 1570 he traveled to Paris with the cardinal. Frankness of speech and a certain habitual want of tact caused a disagreement. He left France next year and took service under Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara. The most important events in Tasso's biography during the following 4 years after the publication of the Aminta in 1573 and the completion of the Gerusalemme Liberata in 1574. The Aminta is a pastoral drama of very simple plot, but of exquisite lyrical charm. It was represented at Ferrara in the summer of 1573, at the critical moment when modern music, under Palestrina's impulse, was becoming the main art of Italy. The Gerusalemme Liberata occupies a larger space in the history of European literature, and is a more considerable work. Yet the commanding qualities of this epic poem, those which revealed Tasso's individuality and which made it a classic, beloved by the people no less than by persons of culture, are akin to the lyrical graces of Aminta. It was published in Tasso's 31st year, and was read to the Duke and to the Princess Lucrezia in the summer of 1575. As in the Rinaldo, so also in the Jerusalem Delivered, he aimed at ennobling the Italian epic by preserving strict unity of plot and heightening poetic diction. He chose Virgil for his model, took the First Crusade for subject, infused the fervor of religion into his conception of the hero Godfrey, but his own natural bias was for romance. Godfrey, a mixture of pious Aeneas and Tridentine Catholicism, is not the real hero of the Jerusalem. Fiery Rinaldo, Ruggiero, impulsive Tancredi, and the chivalrous Saracens, with whom they clash in love and war, divide our interest and divert it from Goffredo. The action of the epic turns on Armida, the beautiful witch, sent forth by the infernal senate to sow discord in the Christian camp. She is coveted to the true faith by her adoration for the crusading knight, and quits the scene with a phrase of the Virgin Mary on her lips. Brave Clorinda, donning armor like Marfisa, fighting in a duel with her devoted lover, and receiving baptism from his hands in her pathetic death. Erminia seeks refuge in the shepherd's hut. These lovely pagan women, so touching in their sorrows, so romantic in their adventures, so tender in their emotions, rivet our attention, while we skip the battles, religious ceremonies, conclaves, and stratagems. Tasso's self-chosen critics suggested every course but the right one, which was to publish the Jerusalem without further dispute. Tasso, already overworked by his precocious studies, by exciting court life and exhausting literary industry, now grew almost mad with worry. His health began to fail him. He complained of headache, suffered from malarial fevers, and wished to leave Ferrara. The Jerusalem was laid aside in manuscript for a time. He opened negotiations with the court of Florence for an exchange of service. This irritated the Duke of Ferrara, who feared that the Medici might get the coveted dedication of that already famous epic. Therefore, he bore with the poet's humors. Meanwhile, Tasso became the subject of delusions, thought that his servants betrayed his confidence, fancied he had been denounced to the Inquisition, expected daily to be poisoned. In 1576, he quarreled with a Farisi gentleman, Madalo, who had talked to him freely about some love affair. In the summer of 1577, he was relating his sorrows once more to the Princess Lucrezia, when he imagined a servant was listening and rushed on him, knife in hand. He was shut up in a room in the palace, and the Duke then took him to his country seat of Bellarigorado. The often-told story, immortalized by Goethe, that a compromising liaison with Leonora de Este came to light, and that Tasso agreed to feign madness in order to cover her honor, must be dismissed. The poet's own temperament and the critics of his Jerusalem Liberata had aggravated his ill health. He was now placed in a Franciscan convent at Ferrara. He escaped at the end of July, disguised himself as a peasant, and went on foot to his sister Cornelia at Sorrento. He seems to have found some peace and healing with his sister, but after a time missed the court circle, and asked to return to Ferrara. There his old irritability returned. In the summer of 1578 he ran away again, traveled through Mantua, Padua, Venice, Urbino, Lombardy. In September he reached Turin on foot, and was courteously entertained by the Duke of Savoy. Wherever he went, wandering like the world's rejected guest, he met with the honor due to his illustrious name. But life was intolerable to him outside Ferrara. In February 1579 he returned at an ill-chosen moment. Alfonso was about to contract his third marriage, this time with a princess of the House of Mantua. The princesses did not want to see him. The Duke was engaged. Tasso broke into terms of open abuse, and was sent out without ceremony to the madhouse of St. Anna. There he remained for 7 years until July 1586. After the first few months of his incarceration, during which he was treated with the harshness than usual towards the insane, he obtained spacious apartments, received his friends, and went abroad attended by friends. Except for occasional odes or sonnets, some written at request, and only rhetorically interesting. A few, like the famous canzone asking for the intercession of Lucrezia and Leonora, inspired by his keen sense of suffering, and therefore poignant, he neglected poetry. Long ago his papers had been sequestered. Now, in 1580, he heard that part of the Jerusalem was being published without his permission and without his corrections. Next year, the whole poem was given to the world, and in the following 6 months, 7 editions appeared. The prisoner had no control over his editors, and from the masterpiece which placed him on the level of Petrarch and Ariosto, he never derived 1 penny of pecuniary profit. The fame of the poem rapidly spread throughout Europe. Within 20 years of its publication, it was translated into English, in the well-known version, itself a masterpiece, of Sir Edward Fairfax, Godfrey of Bouillon, or The Recovery of Jerusalem, 1600. A rival poet at the court of Ferrara, Battista Gorini, undertook to revise and re-edit his lyrics in 1582. In 1585, 2 Florentine pedants of the Della Crusca Academy declared war against the Jerusalem. In 1586, Tasso left St. Anna at the solicitation of Vincenzo Gonzaga, Prince of Mantua. He followed his young deliverer to the city by the Mincio, basked a while in liberty and courtly pleasures, enjoyed a splendid reception from his paternal town of Bergamo, and produced a tragedy called Torresmondo, the first sketch of which dates from 1574. But in the autumn of 1587, we find him wandering once more, through Bologna and Loreto, to Rome, where he stayed in the house of an old friend, Scipio Gonzaga, now Patriarch of Jerusalem. Next year he wandered off to Naples, where he wrote his unfinished poem on Monte Oliveto. In 1589 he returned to Rome, but fell ill. The Patriarch in 1590 again received him, but Tasso's restless spirit drove him forth to Florence. The Florentines said, "Actum est Deo." Rome once more, then Mantua, then Florence, then Rome, then Naples, then Rome, then Naples. Such is the weary record of the years 1590 to 94. We have to study a veritable odyssey of malady, indigence, and misfortune. His health grew feebler, and his genius dimmer. In 1592 he gave to the public a revised version of the Jerusalem, called the Jerusalem Conquistada. All that made the poem of his early manhood charming he rigidly erased. The versification was degraded. The heavier elements of the plot underwent a dull rhetorical development. During the same year, a poem on the creation in blank verse, called Le Sette Giornate, saw the light. In 1594, Clement VIII and his nephew, Cardinal Aldobrandini of St. Giorgio, invited Tasso to Rome. There he was to assume the crown of bays. As Petrarch, he assumed it on the capital. Worn out with illness, Tasso reached Rome in November. The ceremony of his coronation was deferred because Cardinal Aldobrandini had fallen ill, but the Pope assigned him a pension. And, under the pressure of pontifical remonstrance, Prince Avellino, who held Tasso's maternal estate, agreed to discharge a portion of his claims by payment of a yearly rent change. Fortune came too late. Before the crown was worn or the pensions paid, he ascended to the convent of St. Onofrio on a stormy April 1st in 1595. Seeing a cardinal's coach toiling up the steep Trasteverine hill, the monks came to the door to greet it. From the carriage stepped Tasso, the Odysseus of many wanderings and miseries, the singer of the Swedish strains, still vocal, and told the prior he was come to die. He passed away on April 25th, 1595, and the cell he occupied became a place of pilgrimage for his admirers. The last 20 years of his existence had been ineffectual. At the age of 31, the Jerusalem, as we have it, was accomplished. The world, too, was already ringing with the music of Aminta. More than this, Tasso had not to give to literature. But those succeeding years of derangement, exile, imprisonment, poverty, and hope deferred endear the man to us. On this day in history, March 12th, 1579, the start of the siege of Maastricht, part of the 80 Years' War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Maastricht, a frontier town and capital of the province of Limburg, Holland, on the left bank of the Maas, at the influx of the Gier, 19 miles by rail, north by northeast of Liège, in Belgium, is the seat of a court. Population from 1939, 67,609. Maastricht was originally the Triactus Superior, upper ford, of the Romans, and was the seat of a bishop from 382 to 721. Having formed part of the Frankish realm, it was ruled after 1204 jointly by the Dukes of Brabant and the Prince-Bishops of Liège. In 1579, it was besieged, taken, and plundered by the Spaniards under the Duke of Parma. It was taken by the French in 1673, 1748, and 1794. A small portion of the town, known as Vijk, lies on the right bank of the river. A stone bridge connecting the two replaced a wooden structure as early as 1280 and was rebuilt in 1683. Formerly a strong fortress, its ramparts were dismantled in 1871 to 78. The town hall, completed in 1683, contains pictures and tapestry. The old town hall, Oud Stadhuis, a Gothic building of the 15th century, is a museum of antiquities. The Church of St. Servatius, founded by Bishop Manulfus in the 6th century, is the oldest church in Holland. According to one account, it was rebuilt and enlarged as early as the time of Charlemagne. The late Romanesque Church of Our Lady has two ancient crypts and a 13th century choir, but the nave suffered severely from a restoration in 1764. The original Church of St. Martin, in Vijk, occupied the supposed site of an old heathen temple. The Protestant St. Janskerk, a Gothic building of the 13th and 15th centuries, with a fine tower, was formerly the baptistry of the cathedral. The town did not reap the full advantages of its situation till the opening of the railways between 1853 and 1865. At first, a trade was carried on in wine, colonial wares, alcoholic liquors, and salt. There are now manufacturers of china, glass, crystal, and also breweries, tobacco, and cigar factories, and a trade in corn and butter. A short distance south of Maastricht are the great sandstone quarries of Pietersburg, which were worked from the time of the Romans till the end of the 19th century, resulting in subterranean labyrinths covering an area of 15 miles by 9 miles. In the time of the Spanish Wars, these underground passages served to hide the peasants and their cattle. At 5 miles distance are the medieval castles of Eemstenrade, Nieuwburg, and Meer. Maastricht was assaulted by the Germans May 11, 1940, the second day of the invasion of the Low Countries. On this day in history, March 13th, 222, Roman Emperor Elagabalus is murdered alongside his mother, Julius Somius, he is replaced by his 14-year-old cousin, Severus Alexander. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Alexander. Alexander Severus, Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, born 208, died 235. Roman Emperor from 222 to 235. Was born at Arca Caesarea in Palestine on October 1st, 208. He was the son of an imperial procurator. In 221, his grandmother, Julia Messia, persuaded her nephew, the Emperor Heliogabalus, to adopt him as successor and create him Caesar. In the next year, on March 11th, Heliogabalus was murdered, and Alexander was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian and accepted by the Senate. He was then a mere lad, amiable, well-meaning, but entirely under the dominion of his mother, Julia Mamaea, who surrounded him with wise counselors, but who alienated the army by extreme parsimony, while neither she nor her son had a strong enough hand to keep tight the reins of military discipline. Mutinies became frequent in all parts of the empire. To one of them, the life of the jurist and Praetorian prefect, Ulpian, was sacrificed. Another compelled the retirement of Dio Cassius from his command. On the whole, however, the reign of Alexander was prosperous till he was summoned to the east to face the new power of the Sasanians. Of the war that followed we have various accounts. Mommsen leans to that which is least favorable to the Romans. At all events, though the Persians were checked for the time, the conduct of the Roman army showed an extraordinary lack of discipline. The emperor returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, 233, but next year he was called to face German invaders in Gaul, where he was slain on March 18th or 19th, 235, together with his mother, in a mutiny which was probably led by Maximinus, a Thracian legionary, and at any rate secured him the throne. Alexander was the last of the Syrian princes. His advisors were the famous jurist Ulpian, the historian Dio Cassius, and a select board of 16 senators. A municipal council of 14 assisted the city prefect in administering the affairs of the 14 districts of Rome. The luxury and extravagance that had formerly been so prevalent at the court were put down. The standard of the coinage was raised. Taxes were lightened. Literature, art, and science were encouraged. The lot of the soldiers was improved. And, for the convenience of the people, loan offices were instituted for loaning money at a moderate rate of interest. In religious matters, Alexander preserved an open mind. In his private chapel he had busts of Orpheus, Abraham, Apollonius of Tyana, and Jesus Christ. On this day in history, March 14th, 1590, as part of the Battle of Ivry, Henry of Navarre and the Huguenots defeat forces of the Catholic League under Charles, Duke of Mayenne, during the French Wars of Religion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Ivry, 1590. The Battle of Ivry, France, was fought between the Huguenots under Henry IV of France and the Catholics under the Duke of Mayenne on March 14, 1590. On August 1, 1589, Henry III was assassinated and Henry IV of Navarre ascended the French throne, and at the Battle of Arques, won by him on September 28, 1589, he, through his energy, gallantry, and resourcefulness, established himself as the national hero. The next year, the Duke of Mayenne laid siege to Melun, but fell back on the approach of Henry. No sooner had the king withdrawn than he was recalled to confront Mayenne, who, reinforced by the Spaniards, had returned. The two forces, the duke's numbering about 13,000 and the king's somewhat less, met on the plain of Ivry. The following brief account of the battle, which took place, will give some idea of the desultory tactics in vogue at this time. Henry first drew up his army, prayed, and then adjusted his helmet, on the crest of which floated 3 white plumes. Before lowering his visor, he said to his companions, "I will conquer or die. Keep well your ranks, and if the heat of the battle compels you to leave them, always rally. It is one thing to remember in war. This you should do by the 3 pear trees you see yonder on my right. If you lose your banners and your standards, do not, however, lose sight of my white plume, for you will always find it on the road of honor and pointing towards victory." Colonel Schomberg, a captain of mercenaries, rode up to the king and demanded that his men should be paid. Henry, in a rage, rebuked him, and then throwing his arms about him, kissed him, whereupon Schomberg, with tears in his eyes, replied, "O sire, in giving me back the honor you took from me, you take away my life." The charge was sounded.
Je me bats comme un trait, fonce l'ennemi comme un lion furieux, et met les armées à la main.
And Schomberg sped forward like an arrow, hurled himself like a furious lion on the enemy, and died, sword in hand. With the shouts of Vive la Roi, battalions and squadrons followed with him. The two sides clinched, and for several hours attacks were made and repulsed without any decided advantage being gained. A page bearing a white plume in his helmet being killed, a panic seized upon some of Henry's squadrons. At the moment he was busily engaged in a hand-to-hand fight, lost to sight in a melee. Cutting his way out, his white plumes were once again seen, whereupon his soldiers, wild with joy, charged forward, and the enemy was routed. A pursuit to the bridge of Ivry then followed, at which most of the foreign troops in Mayenne's pay were butchered, the French and Swiss alone receiving quarter. The prestige won at Ivry was Henry's true gain and victory. He was accepted by France, and then, as an act of political wisdom, in July 1593, he became a Catholic, and 2 years later brought about the collapse of all opposition. On this day in history, March 15th, 44 BC, the assassination of Julius Caesar, the dictator of the Roman Republic, by a group of senators takes place on the Ides of March. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia going over Caesar and the Civil War. In the meantime, his own position was becoming critical. In 56 BC, at the Conference of Lucca, Caesar's command in Gaul, which would have expired in March 1st, 54 BC, was renewed, probably for 5 years, i.e. to March 1st, 49 BC, and it was enacted that the question of his successor should not be discussed until March 1st, 50 BC, by which time the provincial commands for 49 BC would have been assigned so that Caesar would retain imperium, and thus immunity from persecution until the end of 49 BC. He was to be elected consul for 48 BC, and as the law prescribed a personal canvass, he was by special enactment dispensed from its provinces. But in 54 BC, Julia, the daughter of Caesar and wife of Pompey, died, and in 53 BC, Crassus was killed at Carrhae. Pompey now drifted apart from Caesar and became the champion of the Senate. In 52 BC, he passed a fresh law, De Jure Magistrum, which cut away the ground beneath Caesar's feet by making it impossible to provide a successor to the Gallic provinces before the close of 49 BC, which meant that Caesar would become for some months a private person, and thus liable to be called to account for his unconstitutional acts. Caesar had no resource left but uncompromising obstruction, which he sustained by enormous bribes. His representative in 50 BC, the tribune C. Scorbonius Curio, served him well, and induced the lukewarm majority of the Senate to refrain from the extreme measures, insisting that Pompey, as well as Caesar, should resign the imperium. But all attempts at negotiation failed, and in July 49 BC, martial law having been proclaimed on the proposal of the consuls, the tribunes Antony and Cassius fled to Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon, the frontier of Italy, with a single legion, exclaiming, Alia iacta est. Pompey's available force consisted in 2 legions stationed in Campania and 8 commanded by his lieutenants, Afranius and Petreius, in Spain. Both sides levied troops in Italy. Caesar was soon joined by 2 legions from Gaul and marched rapidly down the Adriatic coast, overtaking Pompey at Brundisium, but failing to prevent him from embarking with his troops for the east where the prestige of his name was greatest. Hereupon Caesar, it is said, exclaimed, I am going to Spain to fight an army without a general, and thence to the east to fight a general without an army. He carried out the first part of this program with marvelous rapidity. He reached Lerida, on June 23rd, and after extricating his army from a perilous situation, outmaneuvered Pompey's lieutenants and received their submission on August 2nd. Returning to Rome, he held the dictatorship for 11 days, was elected consul in 48 BC, and set sail for Epirus at Brundisium on January 4th. He attempted to invest Pompey's lines at Dyrrachium, Durazzo, though his opponent's force was double that of his own, and was defeated with considerable loss. He now marched eastwards in order, if possible, to intercept the reinforcements which Pompey's father-in-law, Scipio, was bringing. But Pompey was able to effect a junction with this force and descended into the plain of Thessaly, where at the battle of Pharsalus, He was decisively defeated and fled to Egypt, pursued by Caesar, who learnt of his rival's murder on landing at Alexandria. Here he remained for 9 months, fascinated, if the story be true, by Cleopatra, and almost lost his life in an emeute. In June 47 BC, he proceeded to the East and Asia Minor, where he came, saw, and conquered Pharnaces, son of Mithridates the Great, at Zela. Returning to Italy, he quelled a mutiny of the legions, including the faithful 10th, in Campania, and crossed to Africa, where a republican army of 14 legions under Scipio was cut to pieces at Thapsus, April 6, 46 BC. Here, most of the republican leaders were killed, and Cato committed suicide. On July 26 to 29th, Caesar celebrated a 4-fold triumph and received the dictatorship for 10 years. In November, however, he was obliged to sail for Spain, where the sons of Pompey still held out. On March 17, 45 BC, they were crushed at Munda. Caesar returned to Rome in September, and 6 months later, March 15, 44 BC, was murdered in the Senate House at the foot of Pompey's statue. On this day in history, March 16, 1696, the Dutch bombarded Givet during the 9 Years' War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the town of Givet. Givet, town of northern France, in the department of Ardennes, 40 miles north by east of Mézières, on the eastern railway between the town and Namur. Population of 1936, 6,583. Commune, 6,923. Givet lies on the Meuse near the Belgian frontier and was formerly an important fortress. It is divided into 3 portions, the citadel, called Charlemont, and Grand Givet on the left bank of the river, and on the opposite bank, Petit Givet. The fortress, the only survival of the fortifications, at the top of a precipitous rock 705 feet high, was founded by the Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, and further fortified by Vauban at the end of the 17th century. It is the only survival of the fortifications of the town, the rest of which were destroyed in 1892. In Grand Givet there are a church and a town hall built by Vauban, and a statue of the composer, Étienne Méhul, stands in the fine square named after him. Petit Givet, the industrial quarter, is traversed by tanneries and glue factories. Pencils and tobacco pipes are also manufactured. The town has considerable river traffic, consisting chiefly of coal, copper, and stone. There is a chamber of arts and manufactures. On this day in history, March 17th, 45 BC, in his last victory, Julius Caesar defeats the Pompeian forces of Titus Labienus and Pompey the Younger in the Battle of Munda. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the battle. Battle of Munda, 45 BC. While Caesar was campaigning in Africa, Pompey's cause was revived in Spain by his sons Gnaeus and Sextus, who had recruited a large army. From Africa, Caesar returned to Rome, and towards the end of 46 BC once again proceeded to Spain, where he suffered a reverse on the river Baetis. But worsting Gnaeus Pompey at Sorcaria, that general retreated southwards towards Carteia. Caesar, however, headed him off and forced him to retrace his steps to Munda. The site of Munda is undecided. Some historians consider that it is the same as modern Munda, but the description of the battle renders this unlikely. It is probably north of the river Singolis, in the neighborhood of Montilla. The town of Munda was situated on a hill, and under its walls Pompey camped on March 15th, 45 BC. The next day, Caesar arrived and entrenched a camp near a small stream some 5 miles away. On the 17th, learning that Pompey had been standing in battle array for some time, he ordered his standards to be raised. The 2 camps were separated by an undulating plain traversed by a stream, and on this plain and behind the stream Caesar marshaled his army, hoping that Pompey would come down from the hill of Munda and fight him in the open. Pompey was in command of some 50,000 men. His position was exceptionally strong, for any attack on him would have been made uphill and over marshy ground. Caesar's army numbered some 40,000, and as Pompey refused to come down from the hill he advanced towards him. On reaching the stream he halted his line, and pointed out to his officers the disadvantage of attacking uphill. This becoming known to men, considerable insubordination was displayed, as they felt certain of victory. Caesar thereupon ordered the advance to be continued. This halt, however, had induced Pompey to believe that Caesar had hesitated through fear, which was the case, and, plucking up courage, he moved his line down the hill, but not so far from Munda that he could not retire to it if defeated. When the lines met, the greatest enthusiasm was shown on both sides. Caesar's legions, charging up the hill with great gallantry, were met by a storm of pila, javelins. Pompey's men, remembering the terrible slaughter at Thapsus, fought with determination and fury. The flight of javelins was followed by a charge which struck Caesar's front like a ram and staggered his line. The clinch then took place, and little by little Caesar's cohorts were pushed back. The situation now became extremely critical, for Caesar was some 5 miles from his camp, and should his line break, annihilation must follow. Seizing a sword and a shield, he rushed forward in the front rank before the ensigns, and by his personal example stimulated the morale of his men. As evening approached, both sides had exhausted their reserves. The auxiliaries had left the field. There was no chance of maneuvering except by cavalry, and though both sides had a considerable number of horsemen, apparently no such maneuver was made. Very few Roman generals ever understood the use of this arm. At length, as the situation became still more critical, Caesar turned to the veteran 10th Legion and cried, "Are you not ashamed to deliver your general into the hands of boys?" Stung by this taunt, the 10th Legion once again charged forward, driving back Pompey's left, and compelling him to draw on his right, in order to reinforce it. Caesar's cavalry then fell upon the weakened right wing, which was badly shaken. This apparently stimulated Caesar's Numidian cavalry into action, for they moved round this wing, dispatched 5 cohorts to head them off. This rearwards movement was mistaken by the Pompeian army as a general withdrawal. Thereupon the line broke and fell back on Munda in confusion. At last Caesar's 8,000 horsemen were launched, and 30,000 of the enemy were slaughtered. Caesar's losses were 1,000 killed and 500 wounded. On this day in history, March 18th, 37 AD, the Roman Senate annuls Tiberius's will and proclaims Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, aka Caligula, or Little Boots, emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Caligula. Caligula, Gaius Caesar, born 21 AD, died 41, Roman emperor from 37 to 41 AD, youngest son of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, was born on August 31st, 12 AD. He grew up in his father's camp among the soldiers and was called Caligula from caligae, or soldier's boots, which he used to wear. He accompanied his father to Syria, and after his death returned to Rome. In 32 he was summoned by Tiberius to Caprae, and by skillful flattery managed to escape the fate of his relatives. After the death of Tiberius, mysterious no doubt, but by no means certainly a murder, Caligula succeeded to the exclusion of Tiberius Gemellus, son of Drusus. The traditional account shows him received with rejoicing, and for 8 months delighting everybody by general concessions, and in particular by reversing Tiberius's policy. Then, apparently, he had a very severe illness, and for the rest of his life was the usual monster of cruelty and vice with whom we become so familiar in the history of the Roman emperors, with a few added extravagances, such as bestowing the consulship on his horse, that seem only explicable on the ground of madness. In the case of a good many emperors, there is some material whereby we can discount some of the excesses of senatorial history. In Caligula's, very little. This much is clear. Caligula is the earliest of a tradition that eventually prevailed, the pioneer of the Oriental type of monarchy. His upbringing tended that way. He was brought up by his grandmother Antonia, and Herod Agrippa was a frequent visitor. Hence his insistence on personal deification, the extravagant honors paid to the imperial family, the increasing importance of the women of the palace, but his anti-Roman tendencies, which made him, perhaps even more than his cruelties, an abomination to the senatorial class which furnished the histories of the time, produced effects favorable to the provinces. The strictness with which Augustus and Tiberius kept the citizenship closed was relaxed. We find provincial equites growing numerous, provincial senators even. He also reversed the policy of Tiberius towards Eastern religions, and rebuilt the temple of Isis that Tiberius had destroyed. Caligula's reign was undisturbed externally. There is only the abortive expedition to the coast opposite Britain. He was murdered by Caius Carria. a tribune in the Guard, on January 24th, 41. That he was the savage tyrant that he appeared to senatorial Rome seems probable, in spite of attempts at rehabilitation. It is a pity, however, that there is not more to show whether he was not. In other directions, something more. On this day in history, March 19th, 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan incorporates the Principality of Wales into England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the conquest of Wales. The English conquest. In both his wars with Llewellyn the Last, Edward had won his victory by the use of sea power against Gwynedd. He had realized that it was only thus that Wales could be crippled, namely by a final blow at the vulnerable danger spot. The dynasty was disposed of by the execution of David, Llewellyn's brother, in 1283. But it was in quite a limited sense that Wales was conquered at this time. Llewellyn's dominions were brought by the Statute of Rhuddlan, 1284, under the direct rule of the Crown. They were divided into counties, furnished with Crown officials, and protected by new castles and boroughs at Carnarvon, Conway, Balmerus, Criccieth, and Harlech. But the old Marcher lordships, baronial preserves where the lords ruled as little kings and royal writs did not run, were not interfered with. Indeed, their number was increased and new franchises arose around Daneby, Ruthin, Wrexham, and Chirk. Even the loyalist princes of Powys and the Vale of Towy were left undisturbed, and among the smaller Welsh landowners the changes were far fewer than might have been supposed. Indeed, in many respects the new Wales differed little from the old. It was still a land of small, independent states, which each governed by its own customs and inhabited by a Welsh-speaking population, among which the old Welsh culture flourished. Edward was no friend to Marcher privileges. In 1291 he brought the lords Brecknock and Glamorgan to book for exercising the right of private war, and in 1301 he revived the Principality of Wales in the person of his son, seemingly in order to create a Welsh authority which could bridle the barons. But tradition was more potent than royal will. Under the weak rule of Edward II, Wales became the battleground of baronial factions, and when Edward III, in 1343, again created a Prince of Wales, it was with a less ambitious purpose. The Black Prince was hardly more than a chief Welsh landlord, the master of Welsh archers and lancemen, who fought with distinction under him at Crecy and Poitiers. There had been revolts of the Welsh under Rhys ap Mardud of Dreslin, 1287, Madag ap Llewellyn of Marianid, 1294, and Llewellyn Bren of Seganid, 1316, but in the course of the 14th century, resistance died down. Even Anglesey, that ancient focus of liberty, produced defenders of the crown, such as the Penmynd family, ancestors of the Tudors, and Sir Howell of the Horseshoes, men who never forgave the murderers of Edward II. The country was growing more prosperous, and a thriving trade sprang up at the ports of Rhuddlan, Balmerus, Havenfordwest, and Carmarthen. It is therefore startling to find that, at the opening of the 15th century, Wales convulsed by a new revolt, more widespread than any of its predecessors. Owain Glyndwr was the direct male representative of the line of Northern Powys, which claims that through his mother to the lands of the Lord Rhys. At the accession of Henry IV, he held a portion of this inheritance on the banks of the Dee and of the Teifi. When in 1400 he broke into rebellion, it was mainly to vindicate personal wrongs, but Henry underestimated both the hereditary prestige and the high abilities of this warrior of courage and genius, with the result that Owen's power grew from year to year, and he was ere long emboldened to proclaim himself independent Prince of Wales. The capture of his enemy Reginald Grey gave him financial resources, that of Edward Mortimer, a valuable ally. He concluded a treaty with Charles VI of France, won the castles of Harlech and Aberystwyth, held parliaments of his subjects, and exercised in a large part of Wales the powers of a ruling prince. The downfall of his friends, the Percys, at Shrewsbury, 1403, was not fatal to the movement. More serious was the failure of the French at Woodbury Hill, 1405, and the loss of two castles, 1408. As the difficulties of Henry IV gradually disappeared, Owain's cause became hopeless, and he died in hiding in 1416. He has never ceased to be the darling hero of Welsh popular tradition. The Glyndŵr movement left Welsh society in ruins, and during the rest of the century recovery was but slow. Disorder returned with the Wars of the Roses, in which Welshmen such as Owen Tudor, died 1461, and William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, died 1469, were deeply involved. It was a Tudor who at last brought peace alike to England and Wales on the field of Bosworth, with a large Welsh following who reckoned that they had avenged in this victory the wrongs of foreign rule. On this day in history, March 20th, 1239, Hermann von Salza, German knight and diplomat, dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the knight. Hermann von Salza, born circa 1170, died 1239, and counselor of the Emperor Friedrich II. Entered the Teutonic Order in early life, became very intimate with Friedrich, took part in the expedition to Damietta in 1221, and accompanied the Emperor on the Crusade of 1228. About 1210 he was appointed Master of the Teutonic Order, and in 1226 received the province of Kulm from Konrad I, Duke of Masovia, in return for help against the Prussians. In 1230 the conquest of Prussia was begun by the order, although not under his immediate leadership. In 1225 he reconciled Valdemar II, King of Denmark, with Henry I, Count of Schwerin, and thus won again the land on the right bank of the Elbe from the Empire, and the recognition of imperial superiority over Denmark. Trusted by Pope Gregory IX and the Emperor alike, he brought about the Treaty of San Germano. Between them in 1230 was the only witness when they met in conference at Annagani in the same year, and it was he who, in 1235, induced Friedrich's son Henry to submit to his father. He died on March 19, 1239, at Barletta in Apulia, and was buried there in the chapel of his order. On this day in history, March 21st, 1556, on the day of his execution in Oxford, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, deviates from the scripted sermon by renouncing the recantations he has made and adds, "And as for the Pope, I refuse him, as Christ's enemy, and Antichrist, with all his false doctrine." Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Archbishop. Thomas Cranmer, born 1489, died 1556, Archbishop of Canterbury, born at Aslacton, or Aslockton, in Nottinghamshire, on July 2, 1489, was the second son of Thomas Cranmer and of his wife, Anne Hatfield. He received his early education, according to Morris, his secretary, from a marvelous severe and cruel schoolmaster. The same authority tells us that he was initiated by his father in those field sports, such as hunting and hawking, which formed one of his recreations in afterlife. To early training, he also owed the skillful horsemanship for which he was conspicuous. At the age of 14, he was sent by his mother, who had, in 1501, become a widow, to Cambridge. He became a Fellow of Jesus College in 1510 or 1511, but had soon after to vacate his fellowship, owing to his marriage to Black Joan, a relative of the landlady of the Dolphin Inn. He was reinstated on the death of his wife, which occurred in childbirth before the lapse of the year of grace allowed by the statutes. He was ordained in 1523 and soon after took his doctor's degree in divinity. He was lecturer in divinity at his own college and public examiner in divinity to the university. In August 1529, the plague known as the sweating sickness drove Cranmer with two of his pupils named Cressy, who were related to him through their mother, to their father's house at Waltham in Essex. The king, Henry VIII, happened at the time to be visiting in the immediate neighborhood, and two of his chief counselors, Garnier, Secretary of State, afterwards Bishop of Winchester, and Edward Fox, the Lord High Almoner, afterwards Bishop of Hereford, were lodged at Cressy's house. Meeting with Cranmer, they were naturally led to discuss the king's meditated divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Cranmer suggested that if the canonists and the universities should decide that marriage with the deceased brother's widow was illegal, and if it was proved that Catherine had been married to Prince Arthur, her marriage to Henry could be declared null and void by the ordinary ecclesiastical courts. The necessity of an appeal to Rome was thus dispensed with, and this point was at once seen by the king, who, when Cranmer's opinion was reported to him, is said to have ordered him to be summoned in these terms: "I will speak to him. Let him be sent for out of hand. This man, I trow, has got the right sow by the ear." At this interview, Cranmer was commanded by the king to lay aside all other pursuits and to devote himself to the question of the divorce. He was to draw up a written treatise stating the course he proposed and defending it by arguments from Scripture, the Fathers, and the decrees of general councils. He was further commanded to Anne Boleyn's father, the Earl of Wiltshire, in whose house at Durham Place he resided for some time. The king appointed him Archdeacon of Taunton and one of his chaplains, and he also held a parochial benefice. When the treatise was finished, Cranmer was called upon to defend its argument before the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which he visited, accompanied by Fox and Gardiner. Immediately afterwards, he was sent to plead the cause before a more powerful, if not a higher tribunal. An embassy, with the Earl of Wiltshire at its head, was dispatched to Rome in 1530, that the matter of the divorce should be disputed and ventilated, and Cranmer was an important member of it. Cranmer returned in September 1530, but in January 1531 he received a second commission from the king, appointed him Consiliaris Regis et ad Caesarum Orator. In the summer of 1531 he accordingly proceeded to Germany as sole ambassador to the emperor. He was also to sound Lutheran princes with a view to an alliance, and to obtain the removal of some restrictions on English trade. At Nuremberg he became acquainted with Osiander, whose somewhat isolated theological position he probably found to be in many points analogous to his own. Both were convinced that the old order must change. Neither saw clearly what the new order should be to which it was to give place. They had frequent interviews, which had doubtless an important influence on Cranmer's opinions. In 1532, Cranmer married Osiander's niece, Margaret. Hooke finds in the fact of the marriage corroboration of Cranmer's statement that he never expected or desired the primacy, and it seems probable enough that, if he had foreseen how the primacy was to be forced upon him, he would have avoided a disqualification which it was difficult to conceal and dangerous to disclose. Expected or not, the primacy was forced upon him within a very few months of his marriage. In August 1532, Archbishop Waltham died, and the king almost immediately afterwards intimated to Cranmer, who had accompanied the emperor in his campaign against the Turks, his nomination to the vacant see. Cranmer's conduct was certainly consistent with his profession that he did not desire, as he had not expected, the dangerous promotion. The papal bulls of confirmation were dated February and March 1533, and the consecration took place on March 30th. In the last, as in the first, of Cranmer's promotion, Henry had been actuated by one and the same motive, the business of the divorce, or rather, of the legitimation of Anne Boleyn's expected issue, had now become very urgent, and in the new archbishop he had an agent who might be expected to forward it with the needful haste. Cranmer, after securing decisions favorable to the king in convocation, wrote a letter to the king, praying to be allowed to remove the anxiety of loyal subjects as to a possible case of disputed succession, by finally determining the validity of the marriage in the archiepiscopal court. There is evidence that the request was prompted by the king, and his consent was given as a matter of course. Queen Catherine was residing at Ampthill in Bedfordshire, and to suit her convenience, the court was held at the priory of Dunstable. Declining to appear, she was declared contumacious, and on May 23rd, the archbishop gave judgment declaring the marriage null and void from the first. The Act of Appeals had already prohibited any appeal from the archbishop's court. 5 days later, he pronounced the marriage between Henry and Anne, which had been secretly celebrated about January 25th, 1533, to be valid. On January 1st, he crowned Anne as queen, and on September 10th stood godfather to her child, the future Queen Elizabeth. In 1536, Cranmer was required to revise his own sentence in favor of the validity of Henry's marriage with Anne Boleyn, and on May 17th, the marriage was declared invalid. With Anne's condemnation by the House of Lords, Cranmer had nothing to do. He interceded for her in vain with the king, as he had done in the cases of Fisher, More, and the monks of Christchurch. His share in the divorce of Anne of Cleves was less prominent than that of Gardiner, though he did preside over the convocation, in which nearly all the dignitaries of the church signified their approval of that measure. Meanwhile, Cranmer was actively carrying out the policy which has associated his name more closely perhaps than that of any other ecclesiastical with the Reformation of England. Its most important feature on the theological as distinct from the political side was the endeavor to promote the circulation of the Bible in the vernacular by encouraging translation and procuring an order in 1538 that a copy of the Bible in English should be set up in every church in a convenient place for reading. Only second in importance to this was the readjustment of the creed and liturgy of the Church, which formed Cranmer's principal work during the latter half of his life. Both in Parliament and in the Convocation he opposed the 6 Articles of 1539, but he stood almost alone. During the period between 1540 and 1543, the Archbishop was engaged at the head of a commission in the revision of the Bishop's Book, 1537, or Institutions of a Christian Man, and the preparation of the necessary erudition, 1543, known as the King's Book, which was a modification of the former work in the direction of Roman Catholic doctrine. In June 1545 was issued his litany, which was substantially the same as that now in use, and shows his mastery of a rhythmical English style. Cranmer was present with Henry VIII when he died, 1547. By the will of the king, he was nominated one of the Council of Regency composed of 16 persons, but he acquiesced in the arrangement by which Somerset became Lord Protector. He officiated at the coronation of the boy king Edward VI, and is supposed to have instituted a sinister change in the order of the ceremony, by which the right of the monarch to reign was made to appear to depend upon inheritance alone, without the concurrent consent of the people. But Edward's title had been expressly sanctioned by Act of Parliament, so that there was no more room for election in his case than in that of George I, and the real motive of the changes was to shorten the weary ceremony for the frail child. During this reign, Cranmer was enabled without let or hindrance to complete the preparation of the church formalities, on which he had been for some time engaged. In 1547 appeared the homilies prepared under his direction. 4 of them are attributed to the Archbishop himself, those on salvation, faith, good works, and the reading of Scripture. His translation of the German Catechism of Justus Jonas, known as Cranmer's Catechism, appeared in the following year. Important as showing his views on a cardinal doctrine was the defense of the true and Catholic doctrine of the sacrament, which he published in 1550. The first prayer book of Edward VI was finished in November 1548 and received legal sanction in March 1549. The second was completed and sanctioned in April 1552. The Archbishop did much of the work and compilation personally. The 42 Articles of Edward VI, published in 1553, owe their form and style almost entirely to the hand of Cranmer. The last great undertaking in which he was employed was the revision of his codification of the canon law, which had been all but completed before the death of Henry. The task was one eminently well suited to his powers, and the execution of it was marked by great skill in definition and arrangement. It never received any authoritative sanction, Edward VI dying before the proclamation establishing it could be made, and it remained unpublished until 1571, when a Latin translation by Dr. Walter Haddon and Sir John Cheek appeared under the title Reformatio Legum Ecclesiasticarum. It laid down the lawfulness and necessity of persecution to the death for heresy in the most absolute terms, and Cranmer himself condemned Joan Bacher to the flames. But he naturally loathed persecution and was as tolerant as any in that age. Cranmer stood by the dying bed of Edward as he had stood by that of his father, and he there suffered himself to be persuaded to take a step against his own convictions. He had pleaded himself to respect the testamentary disposition of Henry VIII, by which the succession devolved upon Mary, and now he violated his oath by signing Edward's device of the crown to Lady Jane Grey. On grounds of policy and morality alike, the act was quite indefensible, but it is perhaps some palliation of his perjury that it was committed to satisfy the last urgent wish of a dying man, and that he was alone remained true to the 9 days queen, when the others who had with him signed Edward's device deserted her. On the accession of Mary he was summoned to the council, most of whom had signed the same device, reprimanded for his conduct, and ordered to confine himself to his palace at Lambeth until the queen's pleasure was known. He refused to follow the advice of his friends and avoid the fate that was clearly impending over him by flight to the continent. Any chance of safety that lay in the friendliness of a strong party in the council was more than nullified by the bitter personal enmity of the Queen, who could not forgive his share in his mother's divorce and her own disgrace. On September 14, 1553, he was sent to the Tower, where Ridley and Latimer were also confined. The immediate occasion of his imprisonment was a strongly worded declaration he had written a few days previously against the Mass, the celebration of which, he heard, had been re-established at Canterbury. In November, with Lady Jane Grey, her husband, and 2 other Dudleys, Cranmer was condemned for treason. Renard thought he had to be executed, but so true a Romanist as Mary could scarcely have an ecclesiastical put to death in consequence of a sentence by a secular court, and Cranmer was reserved for a treatment as heretic by the highest of clerical tribunals, which could not act until Parliament had restored the papal jurisdiction. Accordingly, in March 1554, he and his 2 illustrious fellow prisoners, Ridley and Latimer, were removed to Oxford, where they were confined in the Bocardo, or common prison. Ridley and Latimer were unflinching and suffered bravely at the stake on October 16, 1555. Cranmer had been tried by a papal commission over which Bishop Brooks of Gloucester presided in September 1555. Brooks had no power to give sentence, but reported to Rome when Cranmer was summoned, but not permitted to attend. On November 25th, he was pronounced contumacious by the Pope and excommunicated, and a commission was sent to England to degrade him from his office of Archbishop. This was done with the usual humiliating ceremonies in Christ Church, Oxford, on February 14, 1556, and he was then handed over to the secular power. About the same time, Cranmer subscribed the first 2 of his recantations. His difficulty consisted in the fact that, like all Anglicans of the 16th century, he recognized no right of private judgment, but believed that the state, as represented by monarchy, parliament, and convocation, had an absolute right to determine the national faith, and to impose it on every Englishman. All these authorities had now legally established Roman Catholicism as the national faith, and Cranmer had no logical ground on which to resist. His early recantations are merely recognitions of his lifelong conviction of this right of the state, but his dilemma on this point led him into further doubts, and he was eventually induced to revile his whole career and the Reformation. This is what the government wanted. Northumberland's recantation had done much to discredit the Reformation. Cranmer's, it was hoped, would complete the work. Hence the enormous effect of Cranmer's recovery at the final scene. On March 21st, he was taken to St. Mary's Church and asked to repeat his recantation in the hearing of the people, as he had promised. To the surprise of all, he declared with dignity and emphasis that what he had recently done troubled him more than anything he had ever did or said in his whole life, that he renounced and refused all his recantations as things written with his hand, contrary to the truth which he thought in his heart, and that as his hand had offended, his hand should be burned when he came to the fire. As he had said, his right hand was steadfastly exposed to the flames. The calm cheerfulness and resolution with which he met his fate showed that he felt that he had cleared his conscience, and that his recantation of his recantations was a repentance that needed not to be repented of. It was a noble end to what, in spite of its besettling sin of infirmity of moral purpose, was a not ignoble death. The key to his character is well given in what Hooper said of him, in a letter to Bullinger, that he was too fearful of what might happen to him. This weakness was the worst blot on Cranmer's character. As a theologian, it is somewhat difficult to class him. As early as 1538, he had repudiated the doctrine of transubstantiation. By 1550, he had rejected also the real presence, but here he used the term real somewhat unguardedly, for in his defense, he asserts a real presence, but defines it as exclusively a spiritual presence, and he repudiates the idea that the bread and wine were bare tokens. His views of the church polity were dominated by his implicit belief in the divine right of kings, not of course the divine hereditary right of kings, which the Anglicans felt it necessary to set up against the divine right of popes. He set practically no limits to the ecclesiastical authority of kings. They were as fully the representatives of the church as the state, and Cranmer hardly distinguished between the two. Church and state, to him, were won. On this day in history, March 22nd, 1508, Ferdinand II of Aragon commissions Amerigo Vespucci chief navigator of the Spanish Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci, born 1451, died 1512, merchant and adventurer, who gave his name of Amerigo to the New World as America. Was born at Florence on March 9, 1451. His father, Anastasio Vespucci, was a notary, and his uncle, Fra Giorgio Antonio Vespucci, to whom he owed his education, was a scholarly Dominican and a friend of Savonarola. Amerigo was placed as a clerk in the great commercial house of the Medici, then the ruling family in Florence. A letter of December 30th, 1492, shows that he was then in Seville, and till January 12, 1496, he seems to have usually resided in Spain, especially at Seville and Cadiz, probably as an agent of the Medici. In December 1495, on the death of a Florentine merchant, Gianetto Berardi, established at Seville, who had fitted out the second expedition of Columbus in 1493, and had also undertaken to fit out 12 ships for the King of Spain, April 9, 1495, Vespucci was commissioned to complete the contract. As Ferdinand recalled the monopoly conceded to Columbus, this order of April 10, 1495 was cancelled on June 2, 1497. Private exploring now had an opportunity, and adventurers of all kinds were able to leave Spain for the West. Vespucci claims to have sailed with one of these freelance expeditions from Cadiz on May 10, 1497. Touching at Grand Canary on the way, the 4 vessels he accompanied, going 37 days on a west-southwest course and making 1,000 leagues, are said to have reached a supposed continental coast in 16 degrees north, 70 degrees west, from Grand Canary, June 16, 1497. This should have brought them into the Pacific. They sailed along the coast, says Vespucci, for 80 leagues to the province of Parai, or Lariab, and then 870 leagues more, always to the northwest, to the finest harbor in the world, which, from this description, should be in British Columbia, or thereabouts, thence 100 leagues more to the north and northeast, to the islands of the people called Iti, from which they returned to Spain, reaching Cadiz in October 1498. Still following Vespucci's own statement, he, in May 1499, started on a second voyage of 3 ships under Alonso de Ojeda. Sailing southwest over 500 leagues, they crossed the ocean in 44 days, finding land in 5 degrees south. Thence, encountering various adventures, they worked up to 15 degrees north, and returned to Spain by way of Antigua, Española San Domingo, reaching Cadiz in September 1500. Entering the service of Dom Manuel of Portugal, Vespucci claims to have taken part in a third American expedition, which left Lisbon in May 1501. Vespucci has given 2 accounts of this alleged third voyage, differing in many details, especially dates and distances. From Portugal, he declares that he sailed to Bezaguich, Cape Verde, and thence southwest for 700 leagues, reaching the American coast in 5 degrees south on the 7th or 17th of August. Thence eastward for 300 or 150 leagues, and south and west to 52 degrees south, or 73 degrees 30 minutes. In his own words, 13 degrees from the Arctic Pole, i.e., well into the Arctic continent. He returned, he adds, by Sierra Leone, June 10th, and the Azores, end of July, to Lisbon, September 7th, 1502. His second Portuguese and 4th and last American voyage was alleged by him was destined for Malacca, which he supposed to be in 33 degrees south, really in 2 degrees 14 minutes north. Starting from Lisbon on May 10, 1503, with a fleet of 6 ships, and reaching Bahia by way of Fernando Noronha, unknown, Vespucci declares that he built a fort at a harbor in 18 degrees south, and thence returned to Lisbon, June 18, 1504. In February 1505, being again in Spain, he visited Christopher Columbus, who entrusted him a letter to his own Diego. On April 24, 1505, Vespucci received Spanish letters of naturalization, and in 1508 he was appointed Piloto Mayor, or Chief Pilot of Spain, an office which he held till his death at Seville on February 22nd, 1512. If his own account had been trustworthy, it would have followed that Vespucci reached the mainland of America 8 days before John Cabot, June 16th against June 24th, 1497. But Vespucci's own statement of his exploring achievements hardly carries conviction. The statement is contained in his letter from Lisbon, March or April 1503, to Lorenzo Piero Francisco de' Medici, the head of the firm under which his business career had been mostly spent, describing the alleged Portuguese voyage of March 1501 to September 1502. The original Italian text is lost, but we possess the Latin translation by Jocundus Interpreter, perhaps Giocondo, who brought his invitation to Portugal in 1501. The letter was printed, in some 9 editions, after it was written. The first 2 issues, Mundus Novus and Ispitola Alberdici de Nuovo Mondo, without place or date, appearing before 1504, the third of 1504, Mundus Novus, at Augsburg. 2 very early Paris editions are also known, and one Strasbourg, De Ora Antarctica, 1505, edited by E. Ringman. It was also included in the Paesi Nuovamente Retrovati of 1507, Vicenza, under the title of Nuovo Mondo da al Vespuccio. The connection of the New World with Vespucci, thus expressed, is derived from the argument of this first letter, that it was right to call Amerigo's discovery a New World, because it had not been seen before by anyone. This prepared the way for the American names soon given to the continent. In Vespucci's letter, also written from Portugal, September 1504, and probably addressed to his old schoolfellow Piero Soderini, Gonfalonieri of Florence, 1502 to 1512, from the Italian original, of which 4 printed copies still exist without place or date, but probably before 1507, a French version was made, and from the latter a Latin translation, published at St. Die in Lorraine in April 1507, and immediately made use in the Cosmograph Introductio, St. Die, 1507, of Martin Waldesmuller, Hylicomulus, professor of cosmography in St. Die University. Here we have perhaps the first suggestion in a printed book that the newly discovered 4th part of the world should be called America. Since Alexander von Humboldt discussed the subject in his Examen critique de la Histoire de la Géographie du Nouveau Continent, 1837, Volume 4, the general weight of opinion, in spite of F.A. de Varnhagen, Amerigo Vespucci, son caricature ses escrits, Savoie, Lima, 1865, and other pro-Vespuccian works, has been that Vespucci did not make the 1497 voyage, and that he had no share in the first discovery of the American continent. On this day in history, March 23, 1540, Waltham Abbey is surrendered to King Henry VIII of England, the last religious community to be closed during the dissolution of the monasteries. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the abbey. Waltham Abbey, or Waltham Holy Cross, a market town and urban district in Essex, England, on the Lee and on the Cambridge branch of LNER. Population, 1938 estimated, 7,164. Area, 17.1 square miles. Of the former magnificent cruciform abbey church, the only portion of importance now remaining is the nave, forming the present parish church, the 2 easternmost bays being converted into the chancel. It is a very fine specimen of ornate Norman. On the south side is a lady chapel containing some good decorated work, with a crypt below, thought to date from circa 1316. Of the monastic building there remain only a bridge and gateway, and other slight fragments. At Waltham Cross, about 1 mile west of Waltham in Hertfordshire, is the beautiful cross erected, 1291-94, by Edward I at one of the resting places of the corpse of Queen Eleanor on its way to burial in Westminster Abbey. The Royal Gunpowder Factory is in the immediate vicinity. Government works were built in 1890 at Quinton Hill, half a mile west of the town, for the manufacture of cordite, and the town possesses gun cotton and percussion cap factories, flour mills, malt kilns, and breweries, besides light industries. Watercress is extensively grown in the neighborhood, and there are market gardens and nurseries. On this day in history, March 24th, 1575, Joseph ben Ephraim Caro, Spanish-Portuguese rabbi and author, dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the rabbi. Joseph ben Ephraim Caro, born 1488, died 1575, codifier of Jewish law whose code is still authoritative with the mass of Jews, was born in 1488. As a child, he shared in the expulsion from Spain, 1492, and like prominent Jews of the period, was forced to migrate from place to place. In 1535, he settled in Safed, Palestine, where he spent the rest of his life. Safed was then the headquarters of Jewish mysticism. Caro's mysticism did not take the form of a revolt against authority, but was rather the spiritual flower of pietism. It is, however, as a legalist that Caro is best known. In learning and critical power, he was second only to Maimonides in the realm of Jewish law. He was the author of two great works, in the earlier and greater book, in the form of a commentary, entitled Beth Yosef, on the Torah, designed exclusively for specialists. Caro shows an astounding mastery of the Talmud and the legislative literature of the Middle Ages. He felt called upon to systemize the laws and customs of Judaism in face of the disintegration caused by the Spanish expulsion. But Beth Yosef is by no means systematic. Caro's real aim was affected by his second work, the Shulchan Aruch, Table Prepared. Finished in 1555, this code was published in 4 parts in 1565. The work gradually became the almost unquestioned authority of the whole Jewish world. Its influence was to some extent evil. It put Judaism into a straitjacket. Independence of judgment was inhibited, and the code stood in the way of progressive adaptation of Jewish life to the life of Europe. But its good effects far outweigh the bad. It was a bond of union, a bar to latitudinarianism, an accessible guide to ritual, ethics, and law. It sanctified the home, it dignified common pursuits. When, however, the era of reform dawned in the 19th century, the new Judaism assumed an attitude of hostility to Caro's code. On this day in history, March 25th, 717, Theodosius III resigns the throne to the Byzantine Empire to enter the clergy, allowing Leo III to take the throne and begin the Isaurian dynasty. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Leo III. Leo III, circa 680 to 740, called the Isaurian, Emperor of the East from 717 to 740. Born about 680 in the Syrian province of Kamagani, he rose to distinction in the military service and under Anastasius II was invested with the command of the Eastern Army. In 717 he revolted against the usurper Theodosius III, and marching upon Constantinople, was elected emperor in his stead. The first year of Leo's reign saw a memorable siege of his capital by the Saracens, who had taken advantage of the civil discord in the Roman Empire to bring up a force of 80,000 men to the Bosphorus. By his stubborn defense, the new ruler wore out the invaders who, after 12 months' investment, withdrew their forces. An important factor in the victory of the Romans was their use of Greek fire. Having thus preserved the empire from extinction, Leo proceeded to consolidate its administration, which in the previous years of anarchy had become completely disorganized. He secured its frontiers by inviting Slavonic settlers into the depopulated districts and by restoring the army to efficiency. When the Arabs renewed their invasions in 726 and 739, they were decisively beaten on both occasions by the imperial forces. His civil reforms include the abolition of the system of prepaying taxes which had weighed heavily upon the wealthier proprietors, the elevation of the serfs into a class of free tenants, the remodeling of family and of maritime law. These measures, which were embodied in a new code published in 740, met with some opposition on the part of the nobles and the higher clergy, but Leo's most striking legislative reforms dealt with the religious matters. After an apparently successful attempt to enforce the baptism of all Jews and Montanus in his realm, 722, he issued a series of edicts against the worship of images, 726 to 729. This prohibition of a custom, which had undoubtedly given rise to grave abuses, seems to have been inspired by a genuine desire to improve public morality, and received the support of the official aristocracy and a section of the clergy. But a majority of the theologians and all the monks opposed these measures with uncompromising hostility, and in western parts of the empire people refused to obey the edict. A revolt which broke out in Greece, mainly on religious grounds, was crushed by the imperial fleet in 727, and 2 years later, by deposing the Patriarch of Constantinople, Leo suppressed the overt opposition of the capital. In Italy, the defiant attitude of Pope Gregory II and III on behalf of image worship led to a fierce quarrel with the emperor. The former summoned councils in Rome to anathematize and excommunicate the image breakers, 730-732. Leo retaliated by transferring southern Italy and Greece from the papal diocese to that of the Patriarch. The struggle was accompanied by an armed outbreak in the exarchate of Ravenna, 727, which Leo finally endeavored to subdue by means of a large fleet. But the destruction of the armament by a storm decided the issue against him. His South Italian subjects successfully defied his religious edicts, and the province of Ravenna became detached from the empire. In spite of this partial failure, Leo must be reckoned as one of the greatest of the later Roman emperors. By his resolute stand against the Saracens, he delivered all Eastern Europe from a great danger, and by his thoroughgoing reforms, he not only saved the empire from collapse, but invested it with a stability which enabled it to survive all further shocks for a space of 5 centuries. On this day in history, March 26, 1027, Pope John XIX crowns Konrad II as Holy Roman Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Konrad. Konrad II, born circa 1990, died 1039, Roman Emperor, son of Henry, Count of Spires, and a descendant of Emperor Otto the Great. He founded the Salian or Franconian imperial dynasty. After a contest with a younger member of his family, and in the face of much opposition on the part of the Polish and Burgundian kings and the Duke of Swabia, Konrad was finally crowned at Rome on March 26, 1027. He did much to establish the imperial authority in Italy. He had been crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy in 1026, and might have done more if he had not had to face continual revolts among the German princes. He was very successful in crushing these outbreaks, and he left Germany far stronger and greater in territory than he found it. He sought to establish the hereditary principle in Italy, and in a lesser degree in Germany, and to unite the two countries by marriage ties. His ecclesiastical policy was firm and autocratic, and he substituted Justinian's code in Lombardy for the old Lombard laws. He died at Utrecht on June 4, 1039, and was buried in the cathedral he had begun to build at Spires. On this day in history, March 27th, 1329, Pope John XXII issues his In Argo Dominico, condemning some writings of Meister Eckhart as heretical. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the philosopher. Johannes Eckhart, also known as Meister Eckhart, born around 1260, died 1327, German philosopher, the first of the great speculative mystics of the West, was born at Holkheim, near Gotha. He entered the Dominican order and in 1302 became a master of theology in Paris. 2 years later he was made provincial of his order for Saxony and in 1307 vicar general for Bohemia. In both provinces he was distinguished for his practical reforms and for his power in preaching. Released from his offices in 1311, Eckhart taught in Paris until 1314, when he was sent to Strasbourg. Later, he was transferred to Cologne, where, in 1326, the archbishop took proceedings against his doctrines. In the following year, that of his death, Eckhart publicly declared his orthodoxy and appealed to Pope John XXII. In 1329, 28 of his propositions were condemned by the Holy See. Eckhart has been termed a scholastic mystic rather than a mystical scholastic, because he colors the Aristotelian elements in Aquinas with the mysticism of the Pseudo-Dionysus. The two most important doctrines in his, as in all mystical systems, are those of the divine nature and of the relation between God and creatures, especially the human soul. For Eckhart, God is the absolute and infinite being best characterized as nothing on the ground that his simplicity is irreconcilable with a plurality of predicates. If any attribute could be ascribed to him, it would be the S implied in the scriptural ego sum quae sum, though strictly speaking, God is rather than has S. In spite of this assertion that the divine essence and existence are identical, Eckhart goes on to declare that apart from the divine existence there is nothing. Ens tantum unum est et Deus est. Every creature has its own essence, but its existence is that of God, and God and the creature are more closely related than matter or form, or than the parts and the whole. In addition to this pantheistic leaning, the statement that at the same time that God engendered his Son, co-eternal and equal to himself, he created the world, brought Eckhart's orthodoxy under suspicion. The statement may not apply to the exterior effect of the eternal act of God, but Eckhart's interpretation of the in principio of Genesis as the nunc e aeternitatis suggests that it does. Although the divine existence permeates all being, it is regarded by Eckhart as especially manifested in the human soul, whose end is union with God. The union is to be accomplished through knowledge. The soul must first understand that creatures in themselves are nothing, and then, having perceived the continuity of its being with the divine being, it can dispense with the external means of salvation and abandon itself to God, who finds in it his own existence. Eckhart's style is unsystematic and abounding in symbolic expression, but his successful exposition of scholastic doctrines in an undeveloped tongue has made him the father of German philosophical language. On this day in history, March 28, 193, after assassinating the Roman Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorian Guards auction off the throne to Didius Julianus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Didius. Marcus Didius Salvius Julianus, Roman Emperor for 2 months, March 28th to June 2nd, 193 AD. He was the grandson of Salvius Julianus, a famous jurist under Hadrian and the Antonines, and the son of a distinguished general. On the death of Pertinax, the Praetorian Guards offered the throne to the highest bidder. Didius and Sulpicianus, prefect of the city, bid against each other, and finally the throne was knocked down to Didius. The Senate and nobles professed their loyalty, but the people made no attempt to conceal their indignation at this insult to the state, and the armies of Britain, Syria, and Illyricum revolted. Septimus Severus, the commander of the Pannonian legions, was declared emperor and hastened to Italy. Didius, abandoned by the Praetorians, was condemned and executed by order of the state, which at once acknowledged Severus. On this day in history, March 29th, 1461, the Battle of Towton occurs. Edward of York defeats Queen Margaret to become King Edward IV of England, bringing a temporary stop to the War of the Roses. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Towton. Towton, a village in the West Riding of Yorkshire, England, 2.5 miles south of Tadcaster, the scene of a battle fought March 29, 1461, between the armies of York and Lancaster. The party of Lancaster had won the Battle of St. Albans, but, unable to gain admission into London, and threatened by the approach of Edward, the young Duke of York, from the west of England, was compelled to fall back northward. York, having been proclaimed as Edward IV, followed them up into Yorkshire, and on the 27th his leading troops surprised the passage of the Aire at Ferrybridge. The Lancasterians were encamped at Towton, some miles away, covering Tadcaster and York, but a force under Lord Clifford was promptly set out, recaptured Ferrybridge by surprise, and cut to pieces the Yorkist garrison. About the same time, however, Edward's van, under Lord Falkenberg, an experienced soldier, crossed the Aire higher up, and Clifford was compelled to retire. He was closely pressed, and at Dintingdale, within a few furlongs of his own camps, was cut off and killed with nearly all his men. Edward's main body was now close at hand, and the Lancasterians drew up on their chosen battlefield early on the 29th. This field was an elevated plateau, with steep slopes between the present Great North Road and the River Cock, cut in two by a depression called Towton Dale. On opposite sides of this depression stood the two armies, that of York facing north, their opponents southward. Both lines of battle were very dense. On a front of little more than 1,000 yards, the Lancastrian party had nearly 60,000 men. Edward's force, less than 50,000, was not at all present, the rear battle under Norfolk being still distant. Snow and sleet blew in the faces of the Lancastrians and covered the field of battle. The skillful Falkenberg used this advantage to the utmost. Aided by the wind, his archers discharged flights of arrows against the enemy, who replied blindly and feebly, hampered by snow and wind. The Yorkists withdrew until the enemy had exhausted their quivers, and then advanced afresh. Their arrows soon stung the Lancastrians into a wild and disorderly charge. Suffering severe losses, the latter closed with Edward's line of battle. No quarter was given by either party, and on the narrow front the numerical superiority of the Lancastrians counted for little. The long, doubtful, and sanguinary struggle was only decided by the arrival of Norfolk's corps, which charged the enemy in flank. Driven backwards and upwards, the Lancastrians were in a desperate position, for their only way of escape to Tadcaster crossed the swollen waters of the Cock by a single narrow and difficult ford, and when, after a stubborn struggle, they finally broke and fled, they were slaughtered in thousands as they tried to cross. At the close of the day, the defeated army had ceased to exist. 25,000 Lancastrian and 8,000 Yorkist dead were buried in and about Towton. On this day in history, March 30th, 1282, the people of Sicily rebel against the Angevin king Charles I in what now becomes known as the Sicilian Vespers. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Vespers. Sicilian Vespers, the revolution of the Sicilians against Angevin domination, so called because it broke out at the hour of Vespers on Easter Tuesday, 1282. The government of Charles I of Anjou was highly oppressive, and the people of Sicily were strongly attached to the house of Hohenstaufen. The actual outbreak was a purely unpremeditated popular movement. Charles, at the time, was making preparations for an attack on the East Roman Empire, and heavily taxing the Sicilians in order to meet his expenses. Peter III, King of Aragon, wishing to assert the claims to Sicily which he possessed in right of his wife Constanza, daughter of Manfred, was negotiating with the enemies of Charles, when the people of Sicily, goaded beyond endurance, rose unexpectedly against their leaders. On March 31st, 1282, a riot broke out in a church near Palermo, in consequence, according to tradition, of the insults of a French soldier towards a Sicilian woman, and a general massacre of the French began. The rising spread to the city, where a republic was proclaimed, and then through the rest of the island. Thousands of Frenchmen, women, and children were butchered. There may be some exaggeration in the wholesale character of the slaughter, and by the end of April the whole of Sicily was in the hands of the rebels. Charles at once led an expedition against the Sicilians and besieged Messina. The island was saved from reconquest by the intervention of Peter of Aragon, but this intervention changed the character of the movement, and the free communes which had been proclaimed throughout the island had to submit to royal authority and a revived feudalism. Peter, having reached Palermo in September 1282, accepted the Sicilian crown and declared war on Charles. On this day in history, March 31st, 1492, Queen Isabella of Castile issues the Alhambra decree, ordering her 150,000 Jewish and Muslim subjects to convert to Christianity or face expulsion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Alhambra. The Alhambra, an ancient palace and fortress of the Moorish monarchs of Granada in southern Spain, occupying a hilly terrace on the southeastern border of the city of Granada. This terrace or plateau extends from west-northwest to east-southeast and covers an area of about 35 acres. It is enclosed by a strongly fortified wall, which is flanked by 13 towers. The palace was built chiefly between 1248 and 1354, in the reigns of Alhambra and his successors, but even the names of the principal artists employed are either unknown or doubtful. The splendid decorations of the interior are ascribed to Julius I, who died in 1354. Immediately after the expulsion of the Moors in 1492, their conquerors began by excessive acts of vandalism to spoil the marvelous beauty of the Alhambra. Charles V, 1516-56, rebuilt portions in the style of the period, and destroyed the greater part of the Winter Palace to make room for a structure which has never been completed. Philip V, 1746, Italicized the rooms, and completed the degradation by running up partitions which blocked up whole apartments, gems of taste and patient ingenuity. In 1821, an earthquake caused further damage. The work of restoration undertaken in 1828 by the architect José Contreras was endowed in 1830 by Ferdinand VII, and after the death of Contreras in 1847, it was continued with fair success by his son Rafael, died 1890, and his grandson Mariano. The situation of the Alhambra is one of rare natural beauty. The plateau commands a wide view of the city and plain of Granada, towards the west and north, and on the heights of the Sierra Nevada, towards the east and south. The park, Alameda de la Alhambra, which in spring is overgrown with wild flowers and grass, was planted by the Moors with roses, oranges, and myrtles. Its most characteristic feature, however, is the dense wood of English elms brought hither in 1812 by the Duke of Wellington. The Moorish portion of the Alhambra resembles many medieval Christian strongholds in its threefold arrangement as a castle, a palace, and a residential annex for subordinates. The Alcabeza, or citadel, its oldest part, is built on the isolated and precipitous foreland which terminates the plateau on the northwest. Only its massive outer walls, towers, and ramparts are left. Beyond the Alcazaba is the palace of the Moorish kings, or Alhambra, properly so called, and beyond this, again, in the Alhambra Alta, Upper Alhambra, originally tenanted by officials and courtiers. Access from the city to the Alhambra Park is afforded by the Puerta de las Granadas, Gate of the Pomegranates, a massive triumphal arch dating from the 15th century. A steep ascent leads past the Pillar of Charles V, a fountain erected in 1554, to the main entrance of the Alhambra. This is the Puerta Judiciaria, Gate of Judgment, a massive horseshoe archway surmounted by a square tower and used by the Moors as an informal court of justice. The present entrance to the Palacio Arabe, or Casa Real, is by a small door from which a corridor conducts to the Patio de las Arenas, Court of the Myrtles, also called the Patio de la Alberca, Court of the Blessing or Court of the Pond. This court is 140 feet long by 74 feet broad, and in the center there is a large pond set in the marble pavement, full of goldfish, and with myrtles growing along its sides. There are galleries on the north and south sides, that on the south 27 feet high and supported by a marble colonnade. Underneath it, to the right, was the principal entrance, and over it are 3 elegant windows with arches and miniature pillars. The Sala de los Embajadores, Hall of the Ambassadors, is the largest in the Alhambra, and occupies all the Torre de Camares. It is a square room, the sides being 37 feet in length, while the center of the dome is 75 feet high. This was the grand reception room, and the throne of the Sultan was placed opposite of the entrance. The celebrated Patio de Leones, Court of the Lions, is an oblong court, 116 feet in length by 66 feet in breadth, surrounded by a low gallery supported on 124 white marble columns. A pavilion projects into the court at each extremity, with filigree walls and light-domed roof, elaborately ornamented. The square is paved with colored tiles, and the colonnade with white marble, while the walls are covered 5 feet up from the ground with blue and yellow tiles, with a border above and below enameled blue and gold. In the center of the court is the celebrated Fountain of Lions, a magnificent alabaster basin supported by the figures of 12 lions in white marble, not designed with sculptural accuracy, but as emblems of strength and courage. The Sala de los Abencerrajes, Hall of the Abencerrages, derives its name from a legend according to which Boabdil, the last king of Granada, having invited the chiefs of that illustrious line to a banquet, massacred them here. This room is a perfect square, with a lofty dome and trestled windows at its base. The room is exquisitely decorated in blue, brown, red, and gold, and the columns supporting it spring out into the arch form in a remarkably beautiful manner. Opposite to this wall is the Sala de los Dos Hermanas, Hall of the Two Sisters, so called from 2 very beautiful white marble slabs laid as part of the pavement. There is a fountain in the middle of this hall, and the roof, a dome honeycombed with tiny cells, all different, and said to number 5,000, is a magnificent example of the so-called stalactite vaulting of the Moors. The original furniture of the palace is represented by the celebrated vase of the Alhambra, a splendid specimen of Moorish ceramic art, dating from 1320, and belonging to the first period of Moorish porcelain. Of the outlying buildings in connection with the Alhambra, the foremost in interest is the Palacio de Generalife, or Generalife, the Moorish Genet Alefre, Garden of Arif, or Garden of the Architect. This villa probably dates from the end of the 13th century, but has been several times restored. The Villa de los Martires, Martyrs' Villa, on the summit of Montmayor, commemorates by its name the Christian slaves who were employed to build the Alhambra, and conified here in subterranean cells.